The story of Eddard Stark begins in the ancient stronghold of Winterfell, a fortress that has stood for 8,000 years against the cold winds that sweep down from the north. Born the second son of Lord Rickard Stark, young Ned entered a world where winter is not merely a season, but a way of life, where honor is measured not in words but in actions, and where the old ways still hold power over men's hearts. In the year 263 after Aegon's conquest, Winterfell stood as it always had, massive granite walls enclosing hot springs that steamed even in the deepest winter, Godswood with its ancient heart tree whose carved face had witnessed millennia of Stark history. The castle sprawled across several acres, a labyrinth of covered bridges, inner keeps, and courtyards that spoke of centuries of continuous habitation. This would be Ned's first home, the place that would shape his understanding of duty, family, and the price of leadership. Lord Rickard Stark, Ned's father, embodied the quiet strength that characterized northern leadership. He was not a man given to grand gestures or flowery speeches. His authority came from consistency, from the unwavering application of justice, from his presence at every harvest festival, and his willingness to hear even the smallest farmer's complaint. He ruled the North not through fear, but through respect, earned over decades of fair dealing. Young Ned would watch his father sit in the Great Hall, listening to disputes over grazing rights and stolen sheep, with the same serious attention he gave to matters of rebellion and treachery. The castle itself became Ned's classroom in those early years. He learned to navigate its ancient corridors, to know which stairs led to the armory and which to the library tower, where generations of Meisters had accumulated knowledge. The crypts beneath Winterfell held particular fascination for the boy. Down in that darkness, iron swords rested on the laps of stone kings, meant to keep vengeful spirits in their tombs. The oldest tombs had collapsed centuries ago, their names lost to time. But the more recent Lords of Winterfell still stood in silent testimony to the weight of leadership that would one day fall on Ned's shoulders. Brandon Stark, Ned's older brother, was everything a firstborn son should be. Tall, handsome, bold, quick to laugh and quicker to anger, Brandon was born to rule. He excelled at swordplay, could ride any horse in the stable, and possessed the kind of natural charisma that drew people to him. The contrast between the brothers could not have been more pronounced. Where Brandon was fire, Ned was ice. Where Brandon spoke, Ned listened. Where Brandon led charges, Ned studied tactics. Yet there was no jealousy between them, only the deep bond of brotherhood that transcended their different temperaments. Their sister Lyanna was wild in a way that northern girls were permitted to be, at least while they remained unwed. She rode as well as any man, preferred the training yard to the sewing circle, and possessed a fierce sense of justice that sometimes outpaced her wisdom. Ned adored her, protective in the way younger brothers often are of sisters who clearly need no protection. Lyanna taught Ned that strength came in many forms, that courage was not the province of men alone, and that sometimes the proper response to injustice was immediate and forceful action, consequences be damned. Benjen, the youngest, looked up to all his siblings, but especially to Ned. Perhaps he sensed even then that Ned possessed a steadiness that Brandon lacked, a thoughtfulness that would serve a leader better than Brandon's bold impulses. The boys practiced swordplay in the yards, Ned's movements careful and precise, while Brandon attacked with flourish. The master-at-arms would shake his head, telling Brandon that he fought like a man trying to impress a crowd, while Ned fought like a man trying to survive. Brandon laughed at such criticism. Ned took it to heart. The education of a lord's son encompassed far more than martial training. Maester Wallace, who served Winterfell in those years, ensured that Ned learned to read not just in the common tongue, but in the runes of the first men. He studied the histories of the Seven Kingdoms, learning the names of every major house and their ancestral seats, understanding the web of alliances and ancient grievances that governed relations between the great families. Mathematics, astronomy, the healing arts, even music, though Ned showed little aptitude for the last, all these formed part of his education. But the most important lessons came from watching his father rule. Ned observed how Lord Rickard balanced the needs of different bannermen, how he maintained the North's independence while acknowledging the Iron Throne's authority, how he dispensed justice with mercy when appropriate, but never let mercy undermine the law. He learned that a lord's word must be absolute, that a promise once made could never be broken without destroying the foundation of trust that made civilization possible. These lessons would echo through every decision Ned made in his life, eventually leading him to both greatness and tragedy. The North was a hard land that bred hard people. The summer snows fell even in the warmest months in some regions. Winters could last a generation, freezing the land so completely that only the castles with hot springs or other warming magic could sustain life. The Northmen lived with the constant awareness that death lurked in the cold, that preparation and prudence meant survival, while frivolity and waste meant doom. This shaped their culture in profound ways, creating a people who valued practical skills over courtly graces, who measured wealth not in gold but in stored grain, and who understood that survival depended on community rather than individual glory. The worship of the old gods persisted in the North in ways it had been forgotten in the South. The gods would at Winterfell, with its heart tree whose face had been carved thousands of years ago, remained the center of Stark spiritual life. Ned spent many hours before that ancient weirwood, learning to find peace in silence, understanding that some questions had no answers and some griefs could only be endured, never overcome. The old gods did not promise salvation or eternal life, only that they would remember, that they would witness, and perhaps that was enough. When Ned reached his 8th name day, his father made a decision that would alter the course of his life. Lord Rickard had been corresponding with Jon Arryn, the Lord of the Eyrie and Warden of the East, about fostering arrangements. The practice of noble houses fostering each other's children created bonds between regions and educated young lords in different customs and perspectives. Lord Rickard decided that Ned would be fostered at the Eyrie, while Brandon remained at Winterfell to learn to rule the North. The decision made sense on multiple levels. Brandon, as heir, needed to be seen by the Northern lords, needed to build the relationships that would support his rule when Lord Rickard passed. Ned, as a second son, needed to make his own way in the world, perhaps as a master-at-arms for some castle, or possibly even joining the Night's Watch, as many spare sons of noble houses did. The fostering would give him broader experience, valuable connections, and polish his skills in ways that staying at Winterfell could not. The journey to the Vale of Arryn took several weeks, traveling down the King's Road through the Neck and the Riverlands, finally reaching the Mountains of the Moon that guarded the Vale. For a boy who had never left the North, every league brought wonders. The trees grew differently, the birds sang new songs, even the air felt different, warmer, and somehow less honest than the cold northern wind. Ned studied everything with the quiet intensity that characterized his approach to life, storing away details, building understanding through careful observation. The Eyrie stood as one of the most impressive castles in the Seven Kingdoms, built impossibly high on a mountain peak, accessible only by a treacherous ascent past three-way castles. Stone, snow, and sky, they were called, each progressively smaller and higher, until finally the pale towers of the Eyrie itself emerged from the mountain like something from a song. The approach deliberately impressed and intimidated visitors, forcing even the most powerful lords to recognize the impregnability of House Arryn's seat. Jon Arryn, the lord who would become Ned's second father, was everything Lord Rickard was not. Where Rickard was quiet, Jon was eloquent. Where Rickard kept to his northern fastness, Jon participated actively in the politics of the Seven Kingdoms. Where Rickard taught through example, Jon taught through discussion and debate. Yet both men shared a fundamental commitment to justice and honor, to the idea that nobility meant not privilege, but responsibility, not power, but service. But the most significant aspect of Ned's fostering at the Eyrie had nothing to do with Jon Arryn and everything to do with another ward who arrived almost simultaneously. Robert Baratheon, heir to Storm's End, came to the Vale for many of the same reasons as Ned. He was young, powerful, full of life and laughter, passionate in his loves and hatreds, destined for greatness whether he sought it or not. From the moment the two boys met, they became brothers in all but blood, forging a bond that would shape the destiny of kingdoms. Robert was everything Ned was not, yet somehow they complemented each other perfectly. Robert lived in the moment, while Ned planned for tomorrow. Robert sought glory, while Ned sought to do his duty. Robert loved many women, while Ned would love only one with his whole heart. Robert laughed easily and forgave quickly, while Ned held grudges against himself more than others and found little to laugh about in a world that seemed weighted with sorrow. Yet, in each other, they found the friend that every man needs, someone who accepts you completely while challenging you to be better. The years at the Eyrie passed in a rhythm of training, studying, and growing into manhood. The master-at-arms at the Eyrie was a hard man who had fought in the War of the Ninepenny Kings, and he taught his charges that swordplay was not sport but survival. Ned absorbed these lessons with characteristic diligence, practicing forms long after others had retired, studying the movements of master swordsmen with the same intensity he brought to reading histories. He would never have Robert's strength or Brandon's natural talent, but he developed something perhaps more valuable: absolute reliability, muscle memory so deep that his body would react before his mind could hesitate. Robert, meanwhile, excelled at everything physical. He swung a war hammer that few grown men could lift, fought with a fury that overwhelmed opponents, and seemed to actually enjoy combat in a way that Ned never could. Where Ned saw battle as grim necessity, Robert saw it as glorious test of manhood. This difference in perspective would eventually lead Robert to his throne and Ned to his grave, but in their youth it seemed merely a contrast in temperament rather than a fundamental incompatibility of worldviews. Jon Arryn taught them statecraft, the complex dance of alliances and obligations that governed relations between the Seven Kingdoms. He explained how the Targaryen kings had unified the realm through conquest, but maintained it through accommodation, allowing each region to keep its customs and laws. He showed them how marriages bound families together, how fostering created networks of loyalty that transcended borders, how even enemies could be managed through a combination of strength and diplomacy. These lessons came not as abstract theory, but through active participation in governing the Vale, hearing petitions, resolving disputes, understanding the practical challenges of turning principle into policy. The Vale itself offered education of a different sort. The mountain clans who lived in the Mountains of the Moon represented a constant threat, raiding travelers and occasionally bold enough to attack outlying settlements. Ned participated in several expeditions against these clansmen, experiencing real combat for the first time. These were not practice. Bouts in the yard, but life and death struggles, where hesitation meant death. He learned that men screamed when they died, that blood had a copper smell that got into your clothes and hair, that killing another human being left scars on your soul that no maester could heal. He also learned that he could do it, that when necessity demanded, he could act without hesitation or mercy. During these years, Ned grew from boy to man in body and spirit. He shot up in height until he stood as tall as his father, his body hardening from constant training until he could wear armor all day without fatigue. His face lost the softness of childhood, becoming the weathered, serious visage that would become so familiar in later years. More importantly, his character solidified around the principles of honor, duty, and family that would guide him through the rest of his life, through triumph and disaster, until they led him finally to the steps of the great sept of Baelor. Letters from home arrived irregularly, carried by ships to Gulltown and then up the mountain to the Eyrie. Ned learned that Brandon had been betrothed to Catelyn Tully, daughter of Lord Hoster Tully of River Run. It was a strong match, binding the North and the Riverlands together, and Ned was happy for his brother. He learned that Lyanna had continued to resist their father's attempts to train her in traditional feminine pursuits, that she still rode and hunted like a man, though Lord Rickard had finally secured her betrothal to Robert Baratheon, a match that should have united three great houses and brought peace for a generation. He learned that Benjen was growing into a fine young man, skilled with sword and lance, popular among the castle's small folk. The tourney at Harrenhal in the year 281 brought all these threads together in ways no one could have predicted. The tournament, announced by Lord Walter Went, but widely believed to have been financed by Prince Rhaegar Targaryen himself, promised to be the greatest gathering of knights and lords in a generation. Prizes enormous enough to bankrupt lesser houses drew competitors from every corner of the Seven Kingdoms. Jon Arryn decided to attend, bringing both his wards with him. The journey from the Vale to the God's Eye Lake, where Harrenhal stood, gave Ned his first real look at the Riverlands. The contrast with the north struck him immediately. The richness of the land, the density of villages, the apparent prosperity of even the smallest settlements. The Riverlands occupied the geographic heart of Westeros, crossed by rivers that facilitated trade, blessed with soil that yielded abundant harvests. Yet this same richness made them a battlefield, as every ambitious lord knew that controlling the Riverlands meant controlling the kingdom's interior. Harrenhal itself was a monument to hubris and ambition gone wrong. Built by Harren the Black before Aegon's conquest, it was the largest castle in the Seven Kingdoms, with walls so thick that no siege engine could breach them, towers that scraped the sky. But Harren had not accounted for dragons. Balerion the Black Dread had cooked Harren and all his sons in the tallest tower, melting stone and man together in a demonstration of power that ended the iron-born dominance of the Riverlands forever. Now, Harrenhal stood partially ruined, too massive to maintain properly, cursed according to some, simply impractical according to others. Yet, it provided space for the tournament that would change the destiny of the realm. The gathering at Harrenhal brought together nearly every major noble in the Seven Kingdoms. The Starks came in force. Lord Rickard, Brandon bold and confident, Lyanna beautiful and wild, Benjen young but eager. Robert Baratheon arrived with a delegation from Storm's End, his booming laugh audible across the Tourney grounds. The Lannisters attended in their crimson and gold splendor. The Martells came from Dorne, still nursing grievances about Elaya's marriage to Prince Rhaegar. Lords and ladies from every kingdom filled the pavilions, their banners a riot of color against the gray stone of Harrenhal. Ned noticed her on the second day of the tournament, Ashara Dayne of Starfall, sister to Sir Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning. She moved through the crowds with unconscious grace, her violet eyes seeming to see through the pageantry to something truer beneath. Ned, who had never been comfortable with women, found himself drawn to her in ways he could not explain. Where Robert pursued women with cheerful enthusiasm, collecting them like trophies, Ned had always been reserved, almost shy. But Ashara was different. When she smiled at him, something inside his chest felt like it was breaking and healing simultaneously. They spoke several times during the tournament, conversations that started about inconsequential matters and gradually deepened into discussions of dreams and fears, of the weight of family expectations, of what it meant to know your path was already laid out before you were old enough to choose it yourself. Ashara confessed that she sometimes felt like a prize to be awarded, valued for her beauty and her family name rather than for herself. Ned admitted that being the second son meant freedom, but also meant being unnecessary, spare in case the heir failed, otherwise just another mouth to feed and position to find. The dancing at the great feast provided Ned's moment of courage. He was not a good dancer, never having had much practice or natural aptitude. But when he saw Ashara standing alone for a moment, something in him overcame his natural reserve. He approached and asked awkwardly if she might honor him with a dance. She accepted with a smile that made him forget every step the dancing master had taught him. They stumbled through the dance together, laughing at his mistakes, and in those moments, Ned felt something he had never experienced before, the possibility of happiness that came not from duty fulfilled, but from simple human connection. What might have happened between Ned and Ashara remains one of the great mysteries of that year. Some claimed they became lovers during the tournament, that Ned fathered a child on her that did not survive. Others insisted their connection remained innocent, cut short by events that would sweep them all into war. The truth, like so many truths about those days, died with those who lived it. What remains certain is that Ned Stark left Harrenhal different than he arrived, having touched a kind of joy he would never experience again. But Harrenhal is remembered for other reasons than romance. The tournament itself provided drama enough, with champions falling and unknown knights emerging victorious in unexpected upsets. Yet the moment that would define the tournament came at its conclusion during the final joust. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, the crown prince of the Seven Kingdoms, won the tournament, defeating even Sir Barristan Selmy in the final tilt. As victor, he was granted the honor of crowning the Queen of Love and Beauty, traditionally his wife, Princess Elia of Dorne. Instead, Rhaegar rode past his wife and placed a crown of blue winter roses in Lyanna Stark's lap. The silence that followed this gesture was absolute. Every person present understood the implications, the insult to Elia, the impropriety of publicly honoring another man's betrothed, the political ramifications of a crown prince showing such marked favor to a lord's daughter. Robert Baratheon's face turned the color of old blood, his hands clenching and unclenching. Brandon Stark looked ready to challenge Rhaegar on the spot. Lord Rickard's expression revealed nothing, but those who knew him recognized the fury behind his eyes. Lyanna herself seemed caught between pleasure at the recognition and fear of its consequences. She was barely 15, young enough to be flattered by the attention of the handsome crown prince, too young to fully understand how this moment would reshape her destiny and that of the entire realm. Ned watched his sister's face and felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, a premonition that something terrible had been set in motion, something that could not now be stopped. The remainder of the tournament passed in strained civility. Robert raged privately to Ned about the insult, about Rhaegar's presumption, about what he would do to the prince if their paths ever crossed in battle. Brandon counseled patience, arguing that Rhaegar's gesture meant nothing, that Lyanna was still betrothed to Robert and would remain so. Lord Rickard maintained diplomatic silence, neither condemning nor endorsing the prince's action. But everyone could feel the tension, the sense that some crucial line had been crossed, that the order of things had been disrupted in ways that could not easily be restored. In the months that followed Harrenhal, Ned returned to the Vale to continue his fostering, but nothing felt the same. Letters from home arrived with increasing frequency, carrying disturbing news. Lyanna had disappeared, taken by Prince Rhaegar, according to some reports, having run away with him, according to others. Brandon had ridden to King's Landing in a fury, demanding that Rhaegar come out and die. Instead, King Aerys had arrested Brandon and his companions, summoning their fathers to answer for their son's treason. Lord Rickard Stark answered his king's summons, as honor demanded. He brought a small escort, perhaps 20 men, not enough to fight but sufficient for a lord's dignity. He came to King's Landing believing that this was a matter that could be resolved through diplomacy, that even Mad King Aerys would not violate the fundamental social contract that bound lord to king. He was wrong. Aerys had Brandon bound and his father suspended in a room with wildfire underneath, a rope around his neck connected to a strangulation device. Then the king told Brandon that if he could free himself, he could save his father. Brandon strangled himself trying to reach a sword that had been placed just beyond his reach, while his father roasted alive in his armor. The news reached the Vale like a thunderbolt. Jon Arryn immediately called Ned and Robert to his solar, his face grave. The king had also sent for them, he explained, demanding their heads for the treason of their friend and foster father. The choice before them was simple: betray everything they believed and submit to execution for crimes they had not committed, or raise their banners in rebellion against the Iron Throne. Jon Arryn, the man who had taught them statecraft and honor, who had shown them how to govern justly, made his decision without hesitation. He would not send his wards to their deaths to satisfy a mad king's paranoia. The Vale would rebel, and he would call his banners to war. Robert and Ned, suddenly thrust into leadership roles neither had expected so soon, pledged their support without question. Robert for vengeance against the house that had stolen his betrothed, Ned for justice for his father and brother, both for the simple reason that honor demanded they not submit to tyranny. The war that followed would be called Robert's Rebellion, but it was also Ned's coming of age, his transformation from student to warrior, from ward to lord. Brandon's death made Ned the Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North at 20 years old, responsible for rallying the northern lords and leading them to war. The quiet second son, who had never expected to rule, suddenly bore the weight of an entire kingdom on his shoulders. The initial days of the rebellion passed in a blur of activity. Ned rode north to Winterfell, racing ahead of any force the king might send to secure his home. He arrived to find the castle in mourning, his people devastated by the loss of Lord Rickard, and Brandon, fearful of what would come next. Ned had no time to grieve properly, no opportunity to process his own trauma. He was Lord Stark now. The North looked to him for leadership. The Northern Lords came when he called, bringing their men and their pledges of support. The Manderleys brought their strength from White Harbor. The Umbers came from the Last Hearth, the Karstarks from their castle east of Winterfell, all the great houses and many minor ones, thousands of men answering the ancient call to defend their lord. Ned met with each bannerman, accepted their oaths, and began the massive logistical challenge of organizing, supplying, and moving an army south. But before marching to war, Ned needed to secure his own succession. With Brandon dead, and Benjen still too young to rule if Ned fell in battle, the Stark line hung by a thread. Jon Arryn proposed a solution. The alliance with House Tully that had been arranged for Brandon could be preserved if Ned married Catelyn Tully instead. It made political sense, maintaining the vital connection between North and Riverlands. That it required Ned to set aside any dreams he might have had of Ashara Dane was unfortunate, but necessary. The wedding took place at River Run, a hurried affair conducted between military campaigns. Ned met his bride for the first time when he arrived to marry her. Catelyn Tully had prepared herself to marry Brandon Stark, the bold and handsome heir to Winterfell. Instead, she got his younger brother, quiet and serious, still grieving his family, about to ride off to war. Their wedding night was awkward and brief, neither knowing what to say to the other, both doing their duty as their families required. Ned left the next morning to continue the war, leaving his new wife pregnant with a son he would not meet for nearly a year. The military campaigns of Robert's Rebellion tested Ned in ways his training at the Eyrie had not prepared him for. Leading men in battle was different than participating as one warrior among many. Every decision carried weight, every choice potentially sending men to their deaths. Ned discovered that he possessed a talent for tactics and strategy, understanding terrain and supply lines, anticipating enemy movements and positioning his forces advantageously. But he never gloried in battle the way Robert did, never found joy in victory or satisfaction in revenge. The Battle of the Bells at Stony Sept became a crucial turning point. Robert, wounded and hiding in the town, was hunted by Lord John Connington and a royalist force. Ned arrived with his Northmen and attacked the royalists in the streets of the town itself, fighting house to house in brutal close-quarters combat. The bells of the town rang throughout the battle, calling the people to prayer or perhaps tolling for all the dead that day would claim. Ned found Robert in a brothel, injured but alive, still laughing despite the pain, making jokes about dying in a whorehouse being a fitting end for a warrior. The alliance expanded as the rebellion continued. House Lannister remained neutral, Tywin brooding at Casterly Rock, nursing old grievances against Aerys, but unwilling to commit until a victor seemed clear. Dorne remained loyal to the crown through Elya's marriage to Rhaegar, though Prince Oberyn chafed at the constraints. The Reach under House Tyrell marshaled enormous armies in support of the king. The Stormlands divided, some houses following Robert while others held to their oaths to the Iron Throne. Only the North, the Vale, and the Riverlands stood fully united behind the rebellion. The decisive battle came at the Trident, where Robert faced Prince Rhaegar in single combat while their armies clashed around them. Ned commanded a wing of the rebel army, holding his position against repeated charges by Targaryen loyalists. He saw Robert and Rhaegar meet in the river itself, saw them fight while the current rushed around them, saw Robert's hammer cave in Rhaegar's chest with a sound like breaking ice. The rubies that decorated Rhaegar's armor scattered into the water, creating the ford that would forever after be called the Ruby Ford. With Rhaegar dead, the royalist cause collapsed. The Targaryen loyalists retreated toward King's Landing, but they arrived to find the city already lost. Tywin Lannister had finally shown his hand, arriving with an army claiming to support the king, then sacking the city when the gates opened to admit supposed allies. The Mountain and the Hound killed Princess Elia and her children in their beds, presenting the wrapped bodies to Robert as a proof of Lannister loyalty to the new order. Ned arrived at King's Landing after the sack, riding through streets still littered with corpses, past buildings that still smoldered. He found Jaime Lannister sitting on the Iron Throne, sword across his lap, the body of Mad King Aerys at the base of the steps where the Kingsguard had killed his king rather than let him burn the city with wildfire. Ned felt nothing but contempt for the Kingslayer, regardless of his reasons. A Kingsguard's oath was sacred, absolute. Jaime's breaking of it, even to save thousands, marked him as oathbreaker forever in Ned's eyes. The disagreement between Ned and Robert about the murder of Elia and her children created the first real rift in their friendship. Ned was horrified by the brutality, by the killing of innocents, by Robert's willingness to accept such crimes in his name. Robert argued that the children had to die, that any Targaryen with a claim to the throne would be a rallying point for rebellion. They shouted at each other in the throne room, years of friendship straining under the weight of fundamental moral disagreement. Finally, Ned left King's Landing in disgust, returning north to deal with the one final task the rebellion had left him. Lyanna had not been found in King's Landing, nor among Rhaegar's household. Intelligence suggested she was in Dorne, at a place called the Tower of Joy, guarded by 3 of the Kingsguard's finest: Lord Commander Gerald Hightower, Sir Arthur Dayne, and Sir Oswell Went. Ned gathered 6 companions, men he trusted absolutely, and rode south to retrieve his sister, and, he thought, avenge himself on those who had started this war by taking her. The Tower of Joy stood alone in the red mountains of Dorne, a round tower barely worthy of the name, surrounded by rocky terrain that offered no comfort or resources. 3 Kingsguard stood before it, having waited through the entire war for this moment. Words were exchanged, demands made, and refused. Ned asked why they had not been at the Trident fighting for their prince. Lord Commander Hightower replied that they had been placed here by Prince Rhaegar himself, ordered to protect what lay within. Ned demanded entry. The Kingsguard drew their swords. The fight that followed entered legend. 3 Kingsguard against 7 northern warriors, some of the finest swords in the realm testing themselves against each other. Sir Arthur Dayne wielded Dawn, the legendary sword of House Dayne, forged from the metal of a fallen star, and he was everything the song said and more. He killed 3 men himself, his blade seeming to be everywhere at once, defending and striking in movements too fast for the eye to follow. But numbers and desperation told eventually. Howland Reed, Ned's companion from the swamps of the Neck, struck from behind in a move that saved Ned's life, but violated the honor of single combat. Sir Arthur fell, Dawn clattering to the stones. The dying screams of men filled the air, but from the tower came another sound, a woman crying out in pain and fear. Ned rushed inside, climbing the stairs 3 at a time, his heart hammering, not from exertion, but from terrible premonition. He found Lyanna in a bed soaked with blood, a child crying beside her, attended by no one because everyone who might have helped was dead or dying outside. Lyanna was dying, that much was immediately clear. Childbed fever had taken her, and there was nothing Ned or anyone could do to save her. She reached out to him with hands that trembled, her wild beauty burned away by pain and sickness, leaving only desperation and fear. She made him promise, clutching his hand with fading strength, begging him to protect the child, to keep him safe from Robert's wrath, to never reveal whose son this truly was. Because the child was not just Lyanna's, he was Rhaegar's as well, the product of whatever had truly happened between the Crown Prince and the Wolf Maiden. Whether love or rape or something in between, the result was this: the last male heir of House Targaryen, innocent of any crime, but marked for death by his bloodline alone. Robert would never let him live, could never let him live. The child had to be hidden, protected, raised in secret until such time, if ever, that his true parentage could be revealed safely. Ned made his promise. What else could he do? She was his sister, dying in his arms, begging him with her last breaths. He swore by the old gods and knew that he would protect this child, that he would keep the secret, that he would do whatever was necessary to fulfill his vow. Lyanna smiled then, a shadow of her old wildness, and whispered a name. Aegon, the name she had given her son after Aegon the Conqueror himself. Then she died, and Ned wept as he had not wept for his father or brother, because Lyanna's death was different, personal in a way that the others were not. The child could not be called Aegon, that much was obvious. The name itself announced his heritage, invited investigation. Ned decided then, in that blood-soaked room with his sister growing cold beside him, that the child would be called Jon, after Jon Arryn, who had raised him. And Jon would be his bastard son, carried from war in the south, one more byblow of a conflict that had spawned 1,000 such children. Let people think what they would. Let them judge him for infidelity to his new wife. Let them believe he had dishonored Catelyn Tully even in the early days of their marriage. Better that than the truth, which would get this innocent child killed. The journey back to Winterfell proved long and painful. Ned stopped at Starfall to return Dawn to House Dayne, to inform them that Sir Arthur had died honorably, fighting to the last. Ashara Dayne was there, and she looked at the child in Ned's arms with eyes that held knowledge he feared to acknowledge. Some said later that Ashara had been the child's mother, that Ned had fathered Jon on her at Harrenhal. Let them say it, Ned thought. Let them think whatever story explained a bastard born of war. Ashara said nothing, but shortly after Ned's visit, she threw herself from a tower into the sea. Whether from grief over her brother, or shame over her supposed bastard, or knowledge of secrets too dangerous to live with, no one could say. Winterfell looked the same as when Ned had left it, yet everything was different. He was Lord now, truly Lord, not just filling a role until someone more suitable arrived. The castle was his responsibility, its people his charges, their survival depended on his decisions and his leadership. He carried Jon through the gates, past the curious and judgmental stares of the household, and presented the child to Catelyn as his bastard son, fruit of some wartime encounter he refused to discuss. Catelyn, who had just given birth to their son Robb, who had spent the war pregnant and alone in a strange castle surrounded by her husband's bannermen, who had done everything her duty required, looked at this child with eyes that held fury and hurt and betrayal. Ned offered no explanations, no excuses. He simply stated that Jon was his son and would be raised at Winterfell alongside their true-born children. It was not a request or a negotiation, it was a statement of fact. Catelyn had no choice but to accept it, though that acceptance would never become forgiveness. The early years of Ned's rule were consumed by rebuilding what the war had destroyed. The North had bled men and resources for a cause that brought them no direct benefit. Robert sat the Iron Throne, but he was a Southerner, and the North cared little for Southern politics. What mattered was preparing for winter, always preparing for winter, because winter was coming as surely as the sun would rise, and when it came, only the prepared would survive. Ned threw himself into the work of governance with the same quiet determination he brought to everything. He toured his territories, visiting every major keep and many minor ones, hearing petitions, resolving disputes, reminding his bannermen that House Stark remembered its oaths and expected the same in return. He sat in the great hall of Winterfell, listening to farmers argue about land boundaries and merchants complain about taxes, giving each the same serious attention. He understood that justice was not merely punishing crimes, but resolving conflicts before they became crimes, maintaining the social fabric that made civilization possible. His relationship with Catelyn slowly evolved from dutiful awkwardness to something approaching genuine affection, though it would never be the passionate love of songs. They were partners in the enterprise of maintaining House Stark and governing the North, and in time, they developed respect and care for each other. Catelyn proved an excellent lady of the castle, managing the household with efficiency, educating the children, representing House Stark with dignity. She gave Ned more children, Sansa, Arya, Bran, and finally Rickon, each one a joy and a responsibility, another thread binding him to life and duty. But Jon remained between them always, a permanent reminder of whatever transgression Ned had committed during the war. Catelyn could not love him, could barely stand to look at him, this cuckoo in her nest who reminded her daily that her husband had betrayed her. She never mistreated Jon, never raised her hand to him or spoke cruel words, but her coldness cut deeper than any blow. Ned tried to shield the boy from Catelyn's resentment while knowing he was the cause of it, that his decision to bring Jon to Winterfell had created this permanent wound in his household. Raising Jon alongside his true-born children created complications that Ned had not fully anticipated. The boys grew up as brothers, inseparable despite the differences in their status. Robb and Jon were born within months of each other, and they were as close as twins despite everything that should have kept them apart. They trained together, played together, got into trouble together. Ned loved them both, though he could never quite admit that love equally or publicly. Jon was his nephew, his sister's son, the last living remnant of Lyanna, and protecting him meant maintaining the lie of bastardy forever. The education of his children consumed much of Ned's attention. He wanted them to understand what it meant to be a Stark, to carry that name with honor, to recognize that their position brought obligations rather than just privileges. He taught them himself when possible, though Maesters and Masters-at-Arms provided most of their formal education. But the lessons Ned most wanted to impart could not be taught from books or learned in the training yard. He brought them to witness executions, explaining that the man who passes sentence must swing the sword, that you could not ask others to do your killing for you, that leadership meant taking responsibility for the hardest tasks. He showed them the crypts of Winterfell, the stone kings in their tombs, reminding them that they came from a line stretching back 8,000 years, that they were temporary stewards of something far larger than themselves. He took them to the Godswood, though Catelyn had raised the girls in the faith of the Seven, teaching them that some questions had no answers and that silence before the heart tree was itself a form of prayer. The years passed in the rhythm of seasons, summer stretching longer than any in living memory, bringing prosperity that made the North stronger than it had been in generations. Ned's reputation grew as a just lord who kept his word, who judged fairly, who protected the weak and punished the guilty without favoritism. His bannermen trusted him in ways they had not trusted his father, who had been respected, but also feared. Ned was neither loved nor feared, but respected absolutely, which proved more valuable than either love or fear alone. The Requiem Rebellion in 289. After the conquest called Ned back to war for the first time since Robert's rebellion, Balon Greyjoy, Lord of the Iron Islands, declared independence and attacked the north. Ned called his banners once again, leading northern forces south, while Robert gathered an army in the south. The rebellion was crushed with brutal efficiency, the Iron Fleet destroyed, Pike besieged and taken. Ned personally accepted Balon's submission, demanding his son Theon as hostage to ensure future loyalty. Taking Theon as ward was meant to be a lesson to the Ironborn that rebellion carried consequences, but for Ned, it became something more complex. The boy was 10 years old, taken from his home and family, held as surety for his father's behavior. Ned could not help but feel compassion for him, remembering his own time as a ward, though his experience at the Eyrie had been nothing like Theon's captivity in the north. Ned treated Theon fairly, raised him alongside his own children, but never let him forget that he was a hostage, that his life depended on his father's continued good behavior. The long summer continued, year after year, bringing prosperity, but also making people forget that winter would eventually come. Ned remembered, though. He always remembered. The words of his house were not a boast, but a warning. Winter is coming. No matter how long the summer, no matter how abundant the harvests, winter would eventually arrive, and only the prepared would survive. So Ned prepared, filling the granaries of Winterfell, stockpiling supplies, ensuring that when winter came, his people would not starve. He watched his children grow, seeing fragments of himself and Catelyn in each of them, but also seeing their own unique spirits emerging. Robb developed into the kind of heir Brandon would have been, bold and confident, natural leader that others followed instinctively. Sansa became every inch a lady, beautiful and graceful, dreaming of knights and southern courts. Arya refused to be constrained by expectations of behavior, preferring swords to sewing, much like Lyanna had. Bran loved to climb, scaling Winterfell's walls and towers with the fearlessness of youth. Rickon remained the baby, wild and emotional. And Jon grew into a serious, thoughtful young man, always aware of his status as bastard, trying twice as hard to prove his worth. The arrival of the deserter from the Night's Watch, carrying tales of others in whites, troubled Ned deeply. The man was clearly terrified, driven mad by whatever he had seen in the haunted forest beyond the wall. According to the law, desertion from the Night's Watch meant death. Ned could have sent the man back to Castle Black for execution, but that would have been avoiding his duty. He personally beheaded the deserter, his children watching, Bran seeing his first execution at 7 years old. On the ride back to Winterfell, they found the direwolf pups in the snow, their mother dead, killed by a stag. 6 pups for 6 legitimate Stark children, an omen so clear that even those who did not believe in omens took notice. Jon found his own pup separate from the others, the white runt with red eyes, the one marked as different from his siblings, just as Jon was marked as different from his. Ghost, Jon called him, and the name fit perfectly. The direwolves grew impossibly fast, bonding with the children in ways that went beyond normal animal companionship. Ned had heard legends of skin changers among the first men, of bonds between humans and animals that transcended nature, but he had always dismissed such tales as superstition. Watching his children with their direwolves, he began to wonder if some of the old stories might contain truth after all. Then Robert came north, and everything changed. The king arrived at Winterfell with half the court in tow, Queen Cersei and all 3 royal children, dozens of nobles and guards and servants, an expedition massive enough to strain even Winterfell's legendary hospitality. Robert had grown fat in the years since the rebellion, the warrior Ned remembered replaced by a king who drank too much and ruled too little. But he was still Robert, still Ned's friend, still the brother of his heart, if no longer the brother in arms. Robert's purpose became clear quickly enough. His hand, Jon Arryn, had died, and Robert wanted Ned to take his place. It was a request that seemed reasonable on the surface, the king asking his oldest friend to serve as his chief advisor. But Ned felt the weight of this offer immediately. Accepting meant leaving Winterfell, abandoning his responsibilities in the north, immersing himself in the southern politics he had always avoided. Refusing meant insulting Robert, rejecting the king's trust, potentially damaging the friendship that had survived war and distance and the passage of years. Catelyn urged him to accept, seeing opportunities for their children in southern connections, marriages that could elevate House Stark's position. Robert's proposal that Sansa marry Prince Joffrey seemed to clinch the matter. Ned looked at his daughter, her face glowing with joy at the prospect of marrying a prince, and could not bring himself to deny her this chance. He agreed to become Hand of the King, knowing even as he spoke the words that he was making a terrible mistake. The preparations for departure consumed several weeks. Ned would take Sansa and Arya south with him, giving them experience of the world beyond the north. Robb would remain as acting Lord of Winterfell, learning to rule in his father's absence. Bran and Rickon were too young to travel so far, and Jon, who had hoped to accompany Ned south, would instead take the Black and join the Night's Watch. Ned had delayed this decision as long as possible, but with his own departure imminent, Jon needed to find his place in the world, and the Watch seemed the best option for a bastard with no prospects for inheritance or advancement. The night before their departure, Ned sat in the Godswood before the Heart Tree, seeking counsel from gods who never answered. He knew he was making a mistake, knew that going south would end badly, but he could see no honorable way to refuse Robert's request. A lord had obligations to his king as well as to his lands, and Robert had given Ned everything: his throne, his kingdom, the peace that had allowed the North to prosper. How could Ned refuse him now? The journey south took weeks, following the King's Road through the Riverlands and into the southern kingdoms. Ned watched the landscape change, the North's harsh beauty giving way to softer, richer lands. They stopped at Riverrun to visit Catelyn's family, at Harrenhal, where Ned remembered a Yard tournament that seemed like a lifetime ago. Finally, they reached King's Landing, the great city that sprawled across 3 hills, stinking of refuse and humanity packed too close together, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The Red Keep. That would be Ned's new home bore little resemblance to Winterfell. Where Winterfell was practical and ancient, built for defense and survival, the Red Keep was designed for display and intimidation. Its red stone walls dominated the city below, while the Iron Throne in its great hall served as constant reminder of how the Targaryens had forged the 7 kingdoms. Ned found the throne ugly and uncomfortable, made from the swords of conquered enemies, a monument to conquest rather than justice. Robert assigned Ned chambers suitable for the king's hand, rooms that had been Jon Arryn's until his death. Ned immediately began investigating the circumstances of that death, knowing that Jon would not have simply died of old age without warning. He had been healthy the last time Robert mentioned him, active and engaged in governing. Something had happened, and Ned owed it to his second father to discover the truth. The small council meetings revealed the dysfunction at the heart of Robert's government. The king rarely attended, leaving the actual governing to his counselors who pursued their own agendas. Peter Baelish, called Littlefinger, managed the kingdom's finances through a combination of legitimate revenues and schemes that enriched him personally. Varys the Spider collected secrets and whispered in corners, always knowing more than he should. Grand Maester Pycelle dozed through meetings unless someone mentioned something related to his own interests. Only Sir Barristan Selmy seemed to maintain any sense of duty and honor. The Lannisters dominated the court in ways both subtle and obvious. Cersei sat beside Robert at feasts, playing the role of queen while clearly despising her husband. Jaime served in the King's Guard, his presence a constant reminder to Ned of broken oaths and murdered kings. Tyrion, the dwarf brother, proved more complex than Ned expected, possessed of a sharp wit and sharper intelligence that saw through pretense and hypocrisy with ruthless clarity. Ned's investigation into Jon Arryn's death led him down paths he wished he had never explored. He learned that Jon had been investigating Robert's bastards, meeting with them, asking questions about their appearance. He learned that Jon had consulted a book of genealogy and heraldry, studying the history of marriages between great houses. He learned that Jon had visited Grand Maester Mallion with questions about genetics and heredity. And slowly, piece by piece, Ned began to see what Jon had discovered. Robert's bastards all had black hair and blue eyes, strong Baratheon features that proclaimed their parentage. Robert's legitimate children, all 3 of them, had golden hair and green eyes, pure Lannister features without a trace of Baratheon in them. Ned consulted the same book Jon had studied, learning that whenever Baratheon and Lannister had married in past generations, the children always had black hair. The seed was strong, the book said, meaning Baratheon genes dominated Lannister. Unless the children were not Robert's at all, the conclusion was inescapable and terrifying. Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen were not Robert's children. They were Jaime Lannisters, products of incest between the Lannister twins, bastards masquerading as heirs to the Iron Throne. Jon Arryn had discovered this truth and had been murdered to keep it secret. And Ned, following in his footsteps, now carried knowledge that would destroy the kingdom if revealed, but might destroy it just as surely if kept hidden. Ned had no proof, only circumstantial evidence and genetic probability. He could not simply accuse the queen of adultery and treason without absolute certainty. But he also could not ignore what he had learned, could not let a bastard take the throne when Robert died. He decided to confront Cersei privately to give her a chance to flee with her children before Robert returned from his hunting trip. It was mercy he showed her, though she would call it weakness. The conversation in the Godswood, with Cersei admitting everything with defiant pride, confirming that all 3 children were Jaime's, that she had cuckolded the king for their entire marriage, should have been the moment when Ned ensured the truth came out. But Robert was injured during the hunt, gored by a boar, dying slowly of internal injuries. Ned sat by his friend's bedside, watching Robert fade, and could not bring himself to burden the dying king with this final betrayal. Robert dictated his will, naming Ned as protector of the realm until Joffrey came of age. Ned wrote the words but changed one crucial phrase, replacing "my son Joffrey" with "my rightful heir," giving himself room to reveal the truth and install a legitimate successor. It was the sort of clever deception that Littlefinger would have admired, the kind of political maneuvering Ned had always disdained. But what choice did he have? Robert was dying, and the kingdom needed a legitimate king. Ned's plan, such as it was, depended on the city watch remaining loyal and the small council supporting the revelation of truth. He trusted Littlefinger to deliver the watch's support, believing that even someone as immoral as Petyr Baelish would recognize the necessity of preventing bastards from taking the throne. It was perhaps the most foolish assumption Ned had ever made, trusting a man who openly declared that chaos was a ladder and that no one should be trusted completely. When the moment came, when Robert died, and Ned prepared to reveal the truth about Joffrey's parentage, everything fell apart. The city watch turned on Ned's men. Littlefinger held a knife to his throat, and Ned found himself disarmed and captured before he could speak the words that would have changed everything. He had failed, and in failing, he had doomed not just himself, but potentially everyone who depended on him. The dungeons beneath the Red Keep were dark and cold, a far cry from the chambers Ned had occupied as Hand. He sat in the darkness, trying to understand where he had gone wrong, replaying his decisions, seeing with hindsight all the mistakes that had seemed reasonable at the time. He had trusted Littlefinger because the man had been Catelyn's childhood friend. He had warned Cersei because he could not bear the thought of children being killed for their parents' crimes. He had served Robert's will rather than confronting the ugly truths immediately. Every choice made sense in the moment, but led inexorably to this cell. Varys visited him in the dark, the spider coming to offer deal after deal, each one requiring Ned to compromise his honor just a little more. "Confess to treason," Varys urged. "Acknowledge Joffrey as rightful king. Your life will be spared. You'll be sent to the wall. Your daughters will be safe." Ned refused initially, clinging to his integrity, unwilling to lie even to save himself. But then Varys mentioned Sansa, mentioned what might happen to her if Ned remained stubborn. And Ned's resolve crumbled because protecting his children mattered more than protecting his honor. The confession came in the Sept of Baelor, before a massive crowd gathered to witness the traitor Hand acknowledging his crimes. Ned spoke the words they wanted, admitted to treason he had not committed, acknowledged Joffrey as rightful king when he knew the boy was a bastard born of incest. Every word tasted like ashes, every syllable a betrayal of everything Ned believed, but he spoke them anyway, because Sansa's life depended on his compliance. Then Joffrey, the boy king who was not really a king at all, changed the terms. Instead of mercy, he would have justice. Instead of the wall, Ned would die. Cersei tried to intervene, seeing that her son was making a catastrophic mistake, But Joffrey ignored her, drunk on power, eager to prove himself strong by killing the man who had discovered his secret. Eilen Payne, the royal headsman, drew ice, Ned's own ancestral sword, the Valyrian steel blade that had been in his family for generations. Ned knelt before the steps of the Sept, looked out at the crowd one last time, saw Sansa's face pale with horror, and knew that his death would accomplish nothing. The lies would continue, the bastard would rule, the realm would bleed. All his honor, all his integrity, all his careful adherence to principle had led only to this: a public execution for crimes he had not committed, dying a traitor when he had been trying to save the kingdom. In his final moment, Ned thought not of kings or honor or duty, but of home. He thought of Winterfell in winter, its walls thick with snow, warm inside where the hot springs kept the cold at bay. He thought of Catelyn and the children, hoped they would survive what was coming. He thought of Jon, his nephew, who would never know his true parentage, who would go to his grave thinking himself a bastard. He thought of Lyanna, his promise to her, and hoped that Robert's bastard blood would be enough to keep Jon safe at the wall where the Lannisters could not reach him. The blade fell. Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, Hand of the King, died as he had lived, doing his duty as he understood it, maintaining his principles to the end even when those principles accomplished nothing, keeping his promises even at the cost of his life. His death sparked the War of the Five Kings, the conflict that would tear the Seven Kingdoms apart, proving what he had always feared, that honor alone was not enough to maintain peace, that sometimes the good man lost not because he was wrong, but because the world itself was broken. The legacy Ned left behind would shape the realm for years to come. His children would carry his lessons, applying them in different ways, learning from both his successes and his failures. Robb would try to combine honor with political pragmatism and fail at both. Sansa would learn that survival required adaptation. Arya would understand that sometimes justice required violence that honor forbade. Bran would transcend human concerns entirely, becoming something neither Ned nor anyone else could have anticipated. Jon would struggle with the burden of leadership, trying to do what was right while surrounded by those who only cared about what was effective. Ned Stark's life was a tragedy in the classical sense, a good man brought down not by villainous enemies, but by his own inability to compromise his principles when compromise was necessary for survival. He lived in a world that rewarded deception and punished honesty, that elevated the clever over the just, that preferred comfortable lies to difficult truths. He refused to adapt, refused to become the kind of person who could thrive in such a world, and it killed him. Yet his death also demonstrated something important, that there was value in maintaining integrity even when it accomplished nothing practical, that living according to principles mattered even if those principles led to failure, that the witness of one honest man might inspire others even after his death. The North remembered Ned Stark not as a failure, but as the model of what a lord should be. His children, despite everything, remained Starks in ways that transcended mere name, carrying his lessons into a world that desperately needed them even if it could not acknowledge that need. In the crypts of Winterfell, a statue would eventually stand above Ned's empty tomb, sword across his lap like all the lords of winter before him. The face would be stern and serious, the eyes seeming to judge those who looked upon it, asking silently whether they had fulfilled their duties as Ned had tried to fulfill his. And perhaps that judgment, passed down through generations, would matter more than any throne or crown or temporary victory. Winter came, as Ned had always warned it would. The Night King marched south with his army of the dead, and the Seven Kingdoms discovered too late that their political games were luxuries they could no longer afford. The wars Ned had tried to prevent, the conflicts his death had sparked, had weakened the realm precisely when it needed strength. But the foundations he had built in the North, the lessons he had taught his children, the example of duty and honor he had provided, these things remained. And in the end, when humanity's survival hung in the balance, it was Ned Stark's children and the forces he had shaped who stood against the darkness. Eddard Stark lived 44 years, ruled as Lord of Winterfell for 15, served as Hand of the King for less than 1. In the grand sweep of history, his time was brief, yet his impact resonated far beyond those years, shaping events and influencing people in ways he never saw and could never have anticipated. He was not a perfect man, not a brilliant strategist or a charismatic leader or a skilled politician. He was simply a man who tried to do right as he understood it, who kept his promises regardless of cost, who valued honor over advancement and integrity over survival. That this approach failed in practical terms says less about Ned Stark than it does about the world he inhabited. Perhaps in a better world, in a realm governed by justice rather than power, Ned's values would have led to success and prosperity. But he lived in Westeros, where dragons had once ruled and now human monsters wore crowns, where the Game of Thrones had rules that men like Ned refused to learn. He died because he could not adapt, because he remained true to principles that the world had abandoned, because he believed that honor mattered more than victory. And perhaps in the end, he was right. The Game of Thrones that consumed so many lives and destroyed so many families ultimately meant nothing when winter came. The Iron Throne that everyone fought over was melted by dragonfire, and the kingdom it represented was broken apart. But the North endured, as it always had, led by Starks who remembered the lessons their father had taught them. Duty, honor, family, these things survived when crowns and kingdoms fell. And in the final accounting, perhaps that was victory enough. Eddard Stark, called Ned, the Quiet Wolf, Lord of Winterfell, lived and died according to principles that made his life harder, but his legacy lasting. He kept his promises, protected those he loved, maintained his integrity in a world that punished such qualities, and left behind children who would change the world. His story is not one of triumph, but of tragedy, not of success, but of sacrifice, not of glory, but of duty fulfilled regardless of cost. And perhaps that makes it the most important story of all, the reminder that sometimes losing with honor is worth more than winning through deception, that some things matter more than survival, that the example of one good man can echo through generations, even after his voice has been silenced forever. The North remembers. And what the North remembers most clearly, most proudly, most painfully, is Eddard Stark, who kept his promises and paid the price, who chose honor over survival and integrity over power, who died doing what he thought was right, even though it accomplished nothing, who was in the end simply a man trying his best in an impossible situation, asking no more of others than he demanded of himself, and leaving behind a legacy that no king or crown could match. Winter came. Spring followed. The wheel of seasons turned as it always had and always would. But the memory of Ned Stark remained, carved in stone in the crypts beneath Winterfell, preserved in stories told by northern fires, living on in his children and their children after them, the quiet wolf who roared once briefly before falling silent forever, the Lord who served, the father who protected, the man who kept his promises even when those promises cost him everything. That was Eddard Stark. That was his life, his death, and his everlasting legacy.